Hello, everybody. It's Matt Hoover again, and today we are going to continue our little lecture series here. I'm going to talk about the first half of the third period of the AP U.S. History curriculum, which will roughly correspond with the road to the Revolutionary War and the Revolution itself, while cooking, meal prepping, actually, some chicken adobo for myself. So we're going to use chicken thighs, and if we can fit some drumsticks in, we're going to use them too. All right, so we last left off here with a long discussion anyway about the colonies and sort of what life was like for people in the colonies, different things to know about, different cultural phenomenons and stuff like that. So that is sort of the last thing that we did. Today, we're going to fast forward a little bit, perhaps glossing over some political history of things that are happening in England, certainly not hitting up every detail from the colonies, and fast forward to the coming of a conflict between Britain and France that's called the 7 Years' War. So Britain and France, sort of long-standing imperial rivals who both had a large colonial presence in North America. Britain obviously establishing itself on the Atlantic coast, right? The 13 colonies that we all know and love. France with a much more sparse presence, but an important economic presence for them, more so in the middle of the continent. There's some mold in this onion, but that's going to be fine. More so in the middle of the continent than kind of where Britain was set up on the coast. And these two countries were two of the capital W world, capital P powers at this time, two of the more powerful countries in the world, long-standing rivals. They had been in conflict before this, in fact, fairly often before this, over different colonial disputes and stuff like that. But a new round of conflict between Britain and France revs up in, we'll say, the mid-1750s for our purposes here. Dates aren't going to be super important. So we're looking at some mid-1750s era conflict between France and Britain. This is not happening exclusively in North America by any means. In fact, this is happening sort of all around the world between these two colonial powers because they have far-flung possessions. However, this does greatly affect the colonists in Britain's 13 colonies, who will soon go on to do the American Revolution and all that, because there is a important theater of this war that takes place in what is today we would call the Ohio River Valley. So the whole area of the country that is around the Ohio River is really an important seat of conflict in this larger war, the 7 Years' War between them. Sometimes historians will refer to this war specifically when talking about its kind of theater in North America as the French and Indian War. So you may recall it being called this, but we're talking about the same thing here. Basically, though, we're going to be focusing on this one theater in North America here. So both Britain and France laid claim basically to what is today the Ohio River Valley. The future city of Pittsburgh, in fact, will be an important site of conflict here in the early days of this war. This is a very fertile area that has a lot of good farmland, a lot of good resources, and sort of everything that comes along with that. We definitely see the reasons why both of these imperial powers were interested in establishing their dominance, we'll say, in this territory. And fighting here is going to break out around a place that was then controlled by France and was called Fort Duquesne. It's actually the first appearance is going to be of George Washington in U.S. history. Basically, George Washington is living in Virginia at the time, and he's going to lead an expedition, basically a military expedition on behalf of the British Empire, to go capture Fort Duquesne from France. And indeed, he does this. He renames it Fort Pitt, after the prime minister at the time, who's someone named Lord Pitt. I don't think we can fit any of these in. And that will actually be a place that continues to see quite a bit of action throughout the course of the war, changing hands several times and stuff like that. The military details of the 7 Years' War aren't going to be super important for our purposes. In fact, I would say they're in the grand scheme of things pretty unimportant for the purposes of an AP U.S. history course. If you happen to be someone that's just sort of watching this for, your own, you're free to obviously look up any of this stuff. There's fighting in interesting places, fighting in Canada, fighting off the coast of Maine, obviously fighting, as we said, in the Ohio River Valley. But for the most part, as far as this war goes, we can be okay with saying that we're going to gloss over that. And for our purposes, it's good to know that Britain won this war, which had several results. Firstly, the sort of chief immediate result that you could see like on a map is that France is basically kicked out of North America by Britain. Britain is going to take over French possessions in North America, taking over Canada, taking over this Ohio River Valley area, certainly, and basically stripping France of her possessions in North America. France will appear several times again in our lecture series here, but for now, they're out of the picture in North America. Another thing that this does is throughout the course of the war, it kind of increases the colony's sense of belonging to something together. Famously, during this time, Ben Franklin attempts to get the colonies together in something that he calls the Albany Plan of Union. This is basically an early attempt to kind of get the various colonies who have, vast differences, as we talked about in our last video, on the same page as far as different things that they were going to do to plan for their mutual defense, perhaps establish some sort of centralized government, as I struggle to peel this garlic. And Ben Franklin is attempting to do this. This isn't ultra successful. Not all of the colonies attend his Albany Conference, as he calls it. But nonetheless, it sets some important precedents for some things that will be happening later in today's lecture. So another, I would say, result of this war is like an increased sense in colonial unity, perhaps, at least to some extent. Not an overwhelming sense of it, but definitely something that is happening. However, all of those things said, for the rest of our story today, the most important results of the 7 Years' War are going to be the fact that it cost Britain a lot of money. Remember, there's fighting not only in North America, but sort of all over the rest of the world as well. And they're going to have to find somewhere to, pay for the expenditures that they have accrued in this war. Another result that will come into play more or less immediately is that the result of this war is bad news, especially for Native Americans who sort of relied on their ability to, we'll say, play the British and the French off of each other. With France suddenly gone, Britain becomes much, much more influential and much, much more powerful in the lives of different Native American groups and tribes that are living in that Ohio River Valley region and beyond. They were happy with the French because, as I said, the French settlement, not particularly densely populated, not really a situation where the French are like building large cities and stuff like that. And they're nervous that with Britain sort of in control of this area now, what's going to end up happening is that they're going to expand into the Ohio River Valley in large numbers. So a final result of this war that we should be aware of is Native Americans are very, very nervous about this. So nervous, in fact, that a group of tribes, we're going to discard that, a group of tribes who were not friends or allies before this time are going to form sort of a confederation with each other, led by a Native American leader by the name of Pontiac, like the car, and sort of clashed with British forces shortly after the end of the French and Indian War here. This is an event known as Pontiac's Rebellion, and it's something that we see a decent amount of in U.S. history when we're dealing with the frontier, which is simply that from time to time there will be large confederations of Native American tribes that unite in an attempt to confront the United States, or in this case the British colonies, militarily in some sort of, in what they're hoping to stave off is some sort of wave of expansion. So we have one of these shortly after the end of the 7 Years' War, and this causes Britain to become a little bit nervous about what is happening now. They don't want to sort of have to waste, in their minds, a bunch of resources defending this territory against natives that are upset at American settlers for making their way, across the Appalachian Mountains and into this territory, is while they're already in a tremendous amount of debt. So what we see Britain do in response to Pontiac's Rebellion is actually set up a law that becomes known as the Proclamation Line of 1763, that basically says that for the time being, Americans, colonists, are not going to be permitted to cross the Appalachian Mountains. All right, so from the colonist perspective, the two main things that they are now dealing with in their life are this law, which they're unhappy about because in their view they fought in this war and they want to sort of reap the benefits of fighting in this war. So they're dealing with that. They're dealing with the Proclamation Line of 1763, and they're not pumped about it. And they are also dealing shortly thereafter with a something that they were not used to dealing with at all, and that is taxes. The British Empire is going to decide, partially in response to their debt that we just discussed, that they have accrued from these various imperial wars against France, that it is time to begin to enforce some taxes against the colonies. They pass a series of taxes in different times throughout the 1760s and 1770s. A lot of these have names that you would certainly recognize. The most infamous of them are things like the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act, and then later on we would have other things called like the Townsend Act, and we would have much later on something called the Intolerable Act, which we'll talk about. But basically, Britain's idea here is that the colonists will, in the long run, benefit from this war once we figure out the Native American situation, we'll say. The colonists will sort of get this, large piece of land available to them. And in addition to that, they will, or they have not been paying taxes at all to this point. British citizens pay a large amount of taxes, right? The colonists have not paid taxes at all. So it seemed fair to Britain, it seemed fair to Parliament, who we'll talk about more in a minute, that this sort of end up being the case here, right? That the colonists would sort of pay a amount of taxes. The amount of taxes that they were being asked to pay was actually pretty insignificant compared to the amount of taxes that a British citizen, like living in Britain at this time, would be asked to pay. But nonetheless, the colonists were not used to that, and they do not sort of respond well to this situation. All right, they are very much upset, generally speaking, with this thing that they are now being asked to do by Britain. So much so, in fact, that different types of colonial protests are going to erupt throughout the 1760s and the early 1770s about these taxes and sort of everything that is going on there. All right. We'll talk about that in 1 second, but I do just want to mention and talk a little bit about Parliament. So if you don't know, Parliament is basically the legislative body, the representative body that is in place in Britain during this time. It had actually been in place in Britain for a long time before this as well. A lot of sort of school children, grade school, grammar school folks that take an American history course will be taught that the American Revolution is about overthrowing the tyranny of King George III and sort of establishing a representative government. The reality, though, that while the colonists certainly have room to quibble about Parliament, specifically how they do not have representation in Parliament, at least in a direct sense, Parliament had sort of been calling the shots in England for quite some time. At this point, almost 100 years. George III, I would argue, and perhaps, you could find people that would argue against me here. But I would argue that George III is much more in line with sort of like a contemporary English king, perhaps a Charles III type, than he would be in line with like some medieval English king that sort of runs the country like an absolute monarchy or something like that. It is definitely a parliamentary system in England, and it is definitely a system in which Parliament is sort of the senior partner in its sort of governing relationship anyway that it has with the monarchy. All right, so I think that that'll be important for us to keep in mind. So that is, an important piece of background information. I'm going to wrap this up very quickly, and then we're probably going to cut out the video and come back when this is ready to go in about an hour in my time. But very quickly, so the colonists here are, as we said, very upset about these tax situations that they have to deal with now. And there's a wide variety of forms of protest that different colonists will, sort of be up to in response to some of these new taxes and tax laws. Many of these laws end up getting repealed. Again, don't get bogged down in the details here for our AP purposes, but just know that some of these things were successful attempts at passing taxes, some of them much less so. But we see things like boycotts of British products, boycotts of the specific products that are going to be taxed. We see an increase in smuggling during this time to sort of attempt to get around some of these taxes. We see an increase in things like homespun clothing and whatnot as the result of some of these taxes. All right, so this is sort of a major thing that the United States is attempting to do. Relationship between the colonies and Britain will sort of continue to deteriorate, I would say, throughout the late 1760s and early 1770s. But let's wait and talk about that until it's time to reduce this, which won't be for a bit. So I'm going to leave you for now, and I'll see you back here in just about a half hour or so. Not done yet, but I did want to flip this chicken, so I figured I would do that, look at this nice color, and talk a little bit about where we were. So we were talking, of course, about colonial protests to these British taxes and stuff like that. And it's just important to note that this is a deteriorating situation between the colonies and Britain. This is where we get the famous objections to taxation without representation on behalf or by, rather, the colonists. And we have the British responding by discussing their idea of virtual representation, the idea that the members of Parliament represent the interests of all British citizens, not only the ones from their town or what have you. So there's some debates happening, not only around the actual issues themselves, but sort of on some philosophical stuff that connects to the issues as far as who is owed what in terms of representation and things like natural rights and things like that. The kind of intellectual situation in Europe in particular, but also in the colonies, that is the important piece of background for this, is we're in a philosophical era known as the Enlightenment. A lot of folks thinking a lot about, these various political issues surrounding things like rights, surrounding things like the best and most fair kinds of governments, the social contract, what to do when a government violates that contract and stuff like that. So it's not a surprise in that sense that this whole conversation really goes beyond just the issue of the taxes at hand and sort of spills into this larger thing. All right, I'm going to cover this up, probably let it go for about another half hour, and then we'll do a final reduction and maybe find some veggie to nuke to go along with this. All right, so I'll see you again in about 20 minutes or so, and this isn't going to be done yet, but I think I'm ready to start reducing the liquid, so I'm going to take the lid off here and just sort of let this go on the stove for a bit, get that back up to a little bit of a simmer. And while we're keeping an eye on this, I'll just sort of wrap up my thoughts here. All right, so we have this escalating situation, and a lot of this comes to a head around some events in Boston. Massachusetts is the colony that is arguably the one that is taking all of this most personally. And as a result, we see some things happen in Boston that sort of lead to the outbreak of war between Britain and the United States. So one noteworthy thing happens a little bit before the rest of this, but is something called the Boston Massacre. This is worth being aware of. It's a situation where there's a confrontation, to sort of skip over some details, between protesting colonists and British troops that results in the death of 4 colonists. This is a moment where the colonists are outraged that this happens. This is important because it really spurs on the communications between the different colonies, and Massachusetts sort of taking the lead here in forming these things that later become known as committees of correspondence, which is an important step, we'll say, in getting a organized government established in the colonies. So the Boston Massacre takes place, but the real thing that sort of sets off the direct chain of events, one could argue, that leads to the fighting in the American Revolution is the famous Boston Tea Party, which is an act of protest in which some colonists sneak onto a British vessel and throw lots of chests of tea, British tea, into Boston Harbor as a way of protesting the tax that was on the tea. The British, when this happens, freak out. They close Boston Harbor to all traffic. They implement several other new rules as well. And they pass these rules collectively are known as the Intolerable Acts. So these are, at least by the colonists, they're known as that. In Britain, they're known as the Coercive Acts. So this is a situation where, again, we see a continuous deteriorating between this relation, or in this relationship between the colonists and Britain. If we fast forward a few years, we can actually see the fighting in the Revolutionary War break out in and around Boston. So what ends up happening is there's a rumor that the British are going to arrest some of Boston's colonial leaders, people like Samuel Adams, John Hancock, and this is the famous Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, which is much mythologized in U.S. history. But basically, in 1775, we see the first real fighting in what will later become known as the American Revolutionary War take place outside of Boston in 2 towns called Lexington and Concord. This is sort of like a not super organized colonial militia picking off a British battalion, we'll say. I don't know if that's the right word or not, to be honest, that is on their way to arrest these colonial leaders. And this sort of then spills into larger violence and will also sort of lead to a heightened sense of organizing and the urgency around that the colonists have. The colonists, or all of the colonies, send representatives to a group that's meeting called the Second Continental Congress. There was a first one, too. And these are the folks that will eventually do things like pass the Declaration of Independence in about a year and a half afterwards. The Second Continental Congress makes several important decisions. Firstly, they're going to sort of work together to pull the colonial militias into an attempt to pull them anyway into a more organized army. And they're going to name George Washington as commander-in-chief of this army, a role which he was definitely seeking out, and for which he turned out to be very well suited. Washington has a lot of strengths as a military commander, as a general, that will sort of be one of the colonist side and the revolution's best assets throughout the whole thing. So we have a proto-government organizing itself in the colonies in the form of the Second Continental Congress, and they are hunkering down for a war with Britain. All right. In the meantime, one of the things that had to happen in a very real sense was you have to sell the public on this thing. Just because there's some folks up in Massachusetts fighting against the British doesn't mean that automatically everyone in the colonies is going to be on board with this. Many, in fact, throughout this whole conflict remain loyal to Great Britain. They become known aptly enough as the Loyalists. Hard to give actual percentages and how much individuals cared obviously varied quite a bit. But the point here is that there's like a battle for the minds of the colonists, especially kind of more average Joe type of folks that exist all throughout this process. A key moment in that happens early in 1776 when Thomas Paine publishes his famous pamphlet, Common Sense. What this does is this takes a lot of the more complex Enlightenment ideas that we were discussing a little bit ago in terms of natural rights and sort of what makes good government and when people are justified in sort of severing ties or overthrowing a government. And it sort of distills them down into a language that's more geared towards educated common folks instead of philosophers. And this becomes, if we adjust for population, one of the best-selling documents in the history of the whole United States. Thomas Paine's Common Sense did a lot, I think, to help push public opinion to the point where it was declaring independence was going to be a viable thing to do. And that's what the Second Continental Congress does famously in July of 1776. They issue the Declaration. They do this for several reasons, not the least of which, many people miss this, but not the least of which is to sort of attempt to explain to potential allies around the world in this conflict the American rationale for this war. This isn't simply a colonial rebellion. If it was, then why would France, who still has an empire in other parts of the world, lend its support to the colonies against its traditional rival of Great Britain? So there's a lot of political machinations sort of happening around the passing of the Declaration when it is passed. This declaration more or less takes the form of a list of grievances. That's sort of the heart of it. Particular grievances that the colonists have against Parliament and the King, that they believe justifies severing their ties with it because of their belief in these Enlightenment ideas and things like that. There's a lot of Enlightenment stuff in that document. Famously, Thomas Jefferson, who's the primary author, but is consulting several other of the members of the Second Continental Congress when writing this. Thomas Jefferson famously lists natural rights, certain inalienable rights, as he calls them, as including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is an adaptation of the English Enlightenment philosophers John Locke's list of natural rights, life, liberty, and property. All right. So there's a lot going on in this document, and it's worth paying attention to. It sort of occupies a high place in American mythology for a reason. It's a very well thought out document, and it sort of signals that the stakes for this war are quite high. Right, the United States wants to leave the British Empire and sort of go do their own thing. So this is all part of that. We're not going to get too into the military detail of the American Revolutionary War, only because it's not necessary to know that really for our purposes here in AP world. But I will mention one battle that is very important from a kind of geopolitical type of reason, and that's going to be the Battle of Saratoga in upstate New York. So this battle takes place at a time when the war is going decently well for the colonies, but not super well. they've captured Britain's attention, though, and Britain is sort of over this. They actually offer the colonists a peace deal, basically, where they could sort of retain a certain level of independence, but still be part of the British Empire, still sort of be, under the king and fly the British flag and all of that. The colonies, after this battle takes place, basically go to France, and they say, look, if you want to help sort of pry one of Britain's colonies away from them, us, right, now's your chance to do so. Jump in and help us, or else we're thinking about taking this peace deal. This doesn't sound that bad. France then sort of panics and decides that they are indeed going to jump into this fight, Britain's old imperial rival here, to try to spite Britain, and they end up being a major factor throughout the remainder of the Revolutionary War. So there's quite a bit to that Battle of Saratoga as being an important turning point in the kind of larger geopolitics of this. I'm going to look and see what my veggie options are in my fridge. And as I do that, I'll emphasize again the importance or the brilliance, perhaps, of George Washington as commander-in-chief. This looks fine, and that'll be good. It's a little old, but nothing too obscene there. Washington had to figure out how to sort of put this underdog army together and outlast, basically, the most powerful nation in the world. The war aims of the colonists are a little bit more simple, I think, than the war games of Britain. What am I getting? A knife. Because the colonists basically just need to figure out how to outlast Britain and wait for the British to give up. This is a situation where, they don't need to go into Britain and conquer territory, most likely. If they could sort of last for a couple years against the British, things were going to be going decently well in terms of their odds of getting out of this conflict successfully. So Washington navigated this situation, I think, very well. He sort of understood the politics that were happening in the Continental Congress. He had to convince these folks to make sure that they are committing money and stuff like that to the cause. He has to sort of hold this inexperienced army with no institutions together. Washington, in many ways, is like a remarkable general from the perspective of sort of institution building, right? He sort of, sets examples with his own behavior in many ways. He's a, someone that is very sort of considerate and thoughtful to a lot of the people that are much lower ranking than him, we'll say. And certainly he is not, an uncontroversial figure. He, a very extensive owner of people during this time. We'll talk a lot more about slavery in our next video here. But generally speaking, I think that the colonies were lucky that they were able to get someone like Washington on their side for the Revolutionary War. He was someone that was very, very able in terms of the things that needed to get done. I'm actually going to turn this down a bit because I'm nervous that it might be getting a little bit too reduced. We'll check back in a minute, though. So anyway, the war drags on for several years. It is definitely an underdog situation for the colonies. They sort of, again, are going up against a superior military, the United States, the colonies, the United States, whatever. Not a particularly powerful country for, it won't be another 100+ years until the United States can legitimately say that it's on the level of a world power or something like that. So this is, the reality of what the Revolutionary War was like. All of that said, though, you figure it out. You sort of adopt hit and run type of tactics. You practice, picking your battles carefully. You kind of figure out how to do things on a bit of a shoestring budget. You string it together as best you can. And lo and behold, all of this sort of comes to a head in 1781 in a battle that takes place outside of Yorktown, which is in Virginia. And this becomes, that's fine. This becomes basically the last major battle of the conflict. So at the Battle of Yorktown, there's like a sort of, for the British anyway, an unexpected appearance by the French Navy that sort of ends up trapping them, a large British army at this place in Yorktown. And this is such a devastating blow to the British from a financial standpoint, having all of these troops captured and so on, that they are still, in debt from the 7 Years' War. And they, after this battle, can decide that they no longer wish to sort of spend the resources on the American fighting the Americans in this American Revolutionary War. Had Britain decided that they have to win at all costs, they almost certainly would have won this war. The reality is they were in a position to, beat the young United States militarily almost no matter what, only because of their vastly superior and established institutions. The reality is if they cared to go into a huge amount of debt, they probably could have won that war. But the circumstances were such where this was not the case. So what ends up happening is the defeat at the Battle of Yorktown ends up being sort of like the last major battle of the conflict, and Britain then sort of turns to the negotiating table. And a final peace agreement is hammered out 2 years later in 1783. The Treaty of Paris is signed by all of the participants, and the main thing that happens here is that Britain recognizes the independence of the United States, and the United States then will go ahead to and sever all of its ties with Britain, this type of thing. So that's sort of the revolution in a nutshell. There's a lot of, obviously, military history that you could go into there. I don't want to do that today. I will just say a few kind of final thoughts that I have here as we wait for the broccoli to get done in the microwave. I mentioned a bit earlier that a common way of thinking about the American Revolution is one where we're sort of overthrowing this system of oppression for a system that is much more based on freedom, liberty, and stuff like that. I'm not convinced that is the best way to think about the American Revolution. This is not a tyrannical system that Great Britain has. They are, in many ways, the pioneers of what today we call sort of representative government and everything like that. It's true that the colonists didn't vote directly for people in Parliament, but this isn't a situation where these colonists are being treated particularly unfairly. I always tell my students that, this is a hot take, but if I was an American living during this time, I might have been a loyalist. The tax rate that Britain was asking Americans to pay was way, way, way lower than the tax rate that British citizens had themselves. And to me, that's a decent trade-off. You get the protection of the British Empire, you get a pretty damn low tax rate, and you get, to not have to fight a revolution, which could go off in a number of different directions. Of course, in hindsight, we know that it didn't go off in any particularly crazy directions, unlike, say, the French Revolution, which we'll be dealing with in a couple of lectures. But I'm just saying, I think it sounds like a pretty good deal. So I think the American Revolution is sort of best thought of as a tax revolt more than anything else. The reality is the founders were a particularly wealthy group of people. They were not representative of the lower classes or things like that. God knows there are no enslaved people involved in sort of the decision-making process here. So this is a group of people that are acting in their own self-interest economically. There's nothing wrong with that per se, but I'm the type of person that likes stability. I would rather deal with the devil I know. So I suspect that I would have been a loyalist in the Revolutionary War. And then one final thought that I'll have today before we wrap up this cooking is that it is, in some ways, the easy part to gain your independence. There's a lot of, glorification in the mythology about the Revolutionary War, and I don't mean to dismiss it. I don't mean to dismiss the men that fought in it for everything that they believed in, and for the generations that came after them. What a service this was. But the real hard part is going to be building institutions that will be able to stand the test of time, that will make the United States not like a blip, not a footnote in world history, but a legitimate, viable country that will sort of stay relatively stable for a long period of time. That's the hard part. And that's the stuff that comes next that we'll talk about as far as building government and things like that. It is not at all obvious that that's going to be a successful project here. All right. Countries rise and fall all the time. Experiments fail. This is not a country, as we've established in previous videos, that is super united in terms of their economic interests, in terms of their ways of thinking about values and things like that. So there's going to be a lot of tumultuous debating about what an appropriate way of governing, this pretty varied country is. There's going to be a lot of debate about sort of what the status of slavery in this country ought to be. And there's going to be a lot of political wheeling and dealing that sort of comes along with all of that. So not to dismiss it, but in some ways the Revolutionary War, in my opinion, is the easier part of this. And the harder part is yet to come in the future. All right, I'm going to turn this off. I'm going to say that this is just about done. I'm going to take this broccoli out of the microwave. Oh, it's very hot. Maybe I'll use some oven mitts. I'll let that sit for a minute. And we'll pick out some bay leaves here. So just very quickly, if you're still watching, I'm done lecturing, but this is called chicken adobo. This is like one of the national foods of the Philippines. If you're Filipino and you're watching this, I hope that this isn't offensive to you in any way. I'm not trying to make a legitimate, authentic, classic Filipino version of chicken adobo. I'm just sort of working with the stuff that's available to me at like an average American grocery store. So I know that normally I'm sure you would use a different type of vinegar. You would use different types of soy sauce than I did. I don't know if you would put jalapenos in there or not, but I'm just sort of making it the way that I like it based on what is available to me. This is a great food to do a little bit of meal prepping with. This stuff will hold up fantastically and, in fact, probably get even better in the fridge throughout the week. So that's all. That's my little disclaimer about my chicken adobo. Also, shout out to microwaving vegetables. A great quick way to do some of that, in my opinion. Microwave broccoli is pretty good. Broccoli is like a sponge. It sort of sops up butter or whatever else you want to put in there. Oh, that's buttery. All right. Let's grab a piece of this. Test it out. Get a spoon. Getting a lot of stuff dirty here, but it's going to have to be okay. Broccoli's going to sponge all of this up too. All right, so if I did my job here, ooh, look at that. That is falling off the bone. That's with a spoon. Nope. Bay leaf. All right. Chicken adobo. Jeez. This is such a good recipe. It's so easy. And it is delicious. So if we ever do cooking club again, Camden Catholic students, we may have to fire this up as one of our recipes. We'll see. Wow. All right. With that, I will leave you. I'm going to go eat my dinner. Thanks for watching along, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye-bye.